Brandon. I think that's my name. Brando. I'm starting to mumble. Brand. I'm marked forever. Bran. I'm being cleaned out. Bra. Need support. Brr. I'm cold. B. Gone? Was this the final chapter for Brandon? It certainly seemed that way. He wasn't in a jam, he wasn't in a tight spot, he was nowhere. He had long worried his writing career was one big nothing, and his current predicament seemed to confirm it. This seemed a fitting end for Brandon with a zero. His days as a would-be writer were over. He had spent endless hours staring at the abyss of a blank document, and all that toil of not writing had led him here, the white light at the end of the tunnel. It was warm in the void, cosy even. It felt a little bit like he was slipping into a coma, but a nice one, like after having eaten too much at Sunday lunch. And who would miss him anyway? Victoria Muse? His mum? His landlord? The cute barista at the coffee shop who he'd never summoned up the courage to ask out? The tech support person in Glasgow who he'd spoken to in the middle of the night? What about the other Brandon? Would he miss him? Ah, yes, the other Brandon. The anti-Brandon, the doppel-Brandon. He was the one who put him here, relegated him to the corner of his mind, dragged him to the trash of his brain hole. But how come other Brandon was the real one? How had the alter Brandon won this existential arm wrestle? Why had he become the figment of his own imagination? And wasn't that incredibly unimaginative anyway? Aren't you supposed to conjure up a giant rabbit or something? Was the fact that Brandon just dreamt of another Brandon a symbol of his own creative bankruptcy? This was all clearly some big mistake. Brandon was real and the other one was the figment. He'd simply woken up on the wrong side of this dream within a dream, like so many wake up on the wrong side of bed. He was the fly, trapped in the stomach of the spider, trapped in the stomach of the bird, trapped in the stomach of the cat, trapped in the stomach of the dog, trapped in the stomach of the horse, trapped in the stomach of the dead old lady. He was stuck in a Russian doll of Brandon's and had to break out. All he needed was a wake-up call, and not just to realize that he was a lousy boyfriend, a bad son, and a terrible writer, but that he really needed to get on with his life. Brandon was not going to give in to Brandon without a fight. This was a battle of wills. Except it was a battle of Brandons. There could not be two Brandons. Just as there could not be two Bucks Fizzes on tour. It was not possible. And Brandon was not alone in here. Floating in the void were all the ideas that littered his trash bin. They were not forgotten. They were now proof of his blighted existence as a struggling writer. Didn't the fact that he struggled prove he was alive and kicking? Yes, he would kick down the doors of perception and show other Brandon who's boss. He would stand up and say, I am Brandon, writer, self-employed. I am my own boss. I am Spartacus. Maybe that confused the issue. He wasn't about to be deleted. He was the one in control of this dream sequence. Control. Alt. Delete. That was it. It was time to undo all of this nonsense. He commanded it. But how to force other Brandon to push those buttons? That simple combination of Control, Alt, Delete would bring him back to glorious life. But he had no powers vested in him. Just 13 espressos and a 3-story coffee monster in his tummy-tum. Unless... Other Brandon was suddenly energized. Was he inspired to write? Not quite. What he felt was the Java rising. This wasn't the bad buzz of caffeine withdrawal. This was the brown roar of coffee overload. Espresso shots shot out of other Brandon's eyeballs. Suddenly his body exploded with coffee surging through his veins. He was foaming into a coffee monster, a mocha Hulk, some kind of caffeine dough. Good name. He couldn't control himself. Or rather, he couldn't stop himself pressing Control, Alt, and Delete. And lo, Brandon lived again, born of the primordial mud that splattered the loft. Brandon stood up to other Brandon and uttered the soon-to-be immortal line. Now where were we? Drenched in coffee, other Brandon replied weakly, We. Brandon had confused himself. Me. We. This is all very perplexing. What? The door opened, and it got more confusing for the two Brandons, as in walked Brandon. Now there were 3 Brandons in the loft. Make that 4 Brandons. How had he become one of a brood of Brandi? cut and pasted into existence. What was happening to his apartment? How had this dorm of dormancy become a hub of activity, producing endless copies of himself? Was it some kind of Brandon generator? Another good name. He couldn't share the flat with 3 other versions of himself. 1, he needed some quiet so he could get no work done. And 2, there weren't enough towels. It was clear that one Brandon was dreaming all this, and the others were surplus to requirements. But what could shake them into consciousness? Brandon was out of ideas as how to fix this metaphysical mess. Maybe one of the other Brandi had a bright idea to wrap it all up. How about the thesauri burst in and eat us all? Then I wake up and it's all been a dream. Maybe. What if Sergeant Kaffenfump kicks down the door and arrests us all? Nah. Well, I say the search engine crashes right through the wall. Bing! It needs a bigger ending. Maybe a giant espresso pod descends from the heavens and saves us all. And it turns out that the coffee pods were sending signals to some other universe, full of darkest, richest matter. This is good, write it down. And so the 4 Brandons wrote the denouement together. Maybe all Brandon needed in the first place was a co-writer, someone to bounce off, someone just to listen to his ideas, tell him that, yes, the last-minute appearance of a giant espresso pod descending on the city was a little silly, but it could work. And so, a giant espresso pod descended on the city and beamed the Brandons up to a new world. One where coffee was in glorious abundance and milk was illegal. The end. Brandon woke up. It was Dracula o'clock. No words on the laptop. No sketches on the pad. No messages on the phone. No ideas to speak of. He was all alone. This was heaven. But he wasn't alone. It was Victoria Muse, his muse. Morning. He lived with Victoria. Was this a dream come true?
So, how's the writing going?
Good. Lots of interesting ideas. I have a title. Brandon Generator. It's a bit self-conscious, but...
Oh, sounds like there could be something there. Why don't you tell me all about it over a cup of tea?
Tea? Not coffee?
But you don't drink coffee anymore, Brandon. You gave up. Remember?
Maybe this was a nightmare. Doctor.